Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today we'll be exploring archetypal imagery and its role in Jungian psychology, dream work, and the way we understand ourselves and culture. To help us unpack and understand this on a deeper level, we've invited Dr. Thomas Singer to join us. Tom is a psychiatrist and Jungian psychoanalyst based in the San Francisco Bay Area with a primary affiliation to the CG Jung Institute of San Francisco. He's an accomplished author and editor. He's contributed to a wide range of books, including Cultural Complexes and the Soul of America and The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. And his work there focused on Donald Trump and the collective American psyche. Tom and his wife are very close to their 4 kids and a gaggle of 5 grandchildren, and we were really happy to hear that a 6th grandchild is expected any day now. He has a lifelong interest in Greece, travels there regularly, and has co-edited 3 volumes on ancient Greece, modern psyche. So important to our talk today, particularly, he serves as the president of ARAS, the Archive for Research into Archetypal Symbolism. And ARAS is a unique and wonderful collection of mythological, ritualistic, and symbolic images from across the globe and throughout human history. And for all of us that are analysts, but any of you that are interested in archetypal imagery, this has just been invaluable. All of us have gone there to do research, to learn amazing things. The Institute has about 18,000 photographs, and each are accompanied by a scholarly commentary. This is an invaluable resource that all of us who do research have used extensively. They've got about 18,000 photographs, and each one is accompanied by a scholarly commentary that goes into the cultural context and the psychology of it and the archetypal themes of the images. This organization has a great history over about 80 years, and it truly is a treasure trove for all of us that are interested in Jungian thought. And you may have recognized us talking about ARAS before because they recently, or in the last 10 years, published the Book of Symbols, which is hands down the most useful and relevant book on symbolism that any of us have used or found. So, Tom, welcome to our podcast, and let's just jump in the water and enter into this first question of what is an archetypal image? What are we talking about?
Well, first of all, Joseph, thank you for that very lovely and gracious introduction. And maybe we should begin this conversation by saying how hard it is to define an archetype, and maybe we should try to define it at the beginning, and then maybe we should try it at the end and see if we come up with the same definition, because the theme of archetypes and archetypal symbolism is one of those topics that you do best by circling around. The more you try and nail it down, the harder it is. Whereas if you let the notion of archetype and symbolism flow inside of you and be a kind of living question, it comes alive, and its coming alive is very different than defining it. So I'm really starting with my own hesitation about trying to define it. I remember when I was beginning as a candidate at the Jung Institute in San Francisco in the early 70s. It's hard to believe that, but Joseph Henderson, who was one of the deans of American Jungian psychology, probably did the most to establish the format for how ARAS looks at symbolic images, he asked our group in the first session with him, what is an archetype? And I remember saying to him, well, an archetype is not a thing. It's something that you can't define, and it's an idea, it's a potential of the psyche to create an image, but it doesn't exist in and of itself exactly. And Henderson said he was a very old man at that time. I was 30 years old or something, and he was probably 80 then. He lived to 104, but he said, very good. And I was very, very pleased that that I had said that. And I think what got him was an archetype is not a thing; it's a potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. It's sort of a pattern before experience, or it's the potential for the psyche to create a certain image under certain conditions. Right?
My favorite image evocation of an archetype is what Jung said. Archetypes are like riverbeds, which dry up when the water deserts them, but which it can find again at any time. An archetype is like an old watercourse along which the water of life has flowed for centuries, digging a deep channel for itself. The longer it has flowed in this channel, the more likely it is that sooner or later the water will return to its old bed. And I think that's such a beautifully poetic evocation, a feeling for how things flow, just as you were saying, Tom, straight from Jung.
That quote, Deb, it's one of my favorite quotes. It actually comes from Wotan, which was written by Jung in 1936 when he was wrestling with the rise of Nazism in Hitler's Germany. And you've taken the nicest part of that quote in terms of the archetype filling an old riverbed, because he goes on to say how when the life of nations gets rolling, the archetype floods the old riverbeds and has enormous destructive potential. And he was really speaking about Nazi Germany then, and his sense that we were in for a real flood, just as we're in for a real flood today with the polarization between right and left in the United States, or the conflict between democracy and authoritarianism around the world. These are archetypal forces. And actually that leads to a really interesting point, because we can fall in love with archetypes because they are deeply moving and very powerful, but as we all know as clinicians, they can also be enormously dangerous and destructive.
And I think the reason we think of them as dangerous is, well, one, they're particularly limited. I mean, unlike human beings that have a wide range of possibilities of thinking and acting and creating, archetypes are highly prescribed. So when all of that life force gets funneled into a very specific set of behaviors, it can create too much potency, and we lose track of aspects of our humanity.
I think that's really well said. And then we go back to Deb's point about the beauty of the archetypal too, because they do fascinate us. And one way you know when you're in the presence of an archetype is the power of the power of the emotion that's evoked, and even the sense of awe and dread, both. Because there's as Jung liked to say, there's a numinous power in an archetypal reality which is captivating and which can possess us very quickly in ways that are quite surprising.
I imagine everyone out there is now thinking, or at least I hope they're now thinking, about the power of archetypes, because everybody knows and has lived and has felt that numinosity, the awe, the dread, the beauty, everything from falling in love to a mob doing something that is awful and destructive.
The thing about archetypes, and I'm thinking about Jung's differentiation between the archetype as such, which, Tom, as you were saying before, is without form or content, and then the archetypal image, which is, of course, what you at ARAS concern yourselves with. And Jung also had this, he has the metaphor of the riverbed. He also has this beautiful metaphor about the crystal lattice, that when an element is in suspension in a working on my chemistry here, just a little rusty. But if it's in solution, for example, if salt is dissolved in water, when the water evaporates, the salt crystals will create a predictable structure that is in potential in the liquid. So I love that as an image of what an archetype is, that the image will sort of resolve itself as the water evaporates in a predictable way. So, for example, the archetype of the Great Mother, Jung would say the archetype is such, it isn't an image, it isn't a thing, like you said. But in culture after culture after culture, these images arise. And Deb, I'm thinking about an image that has arisen many times. It arose for Jung at a time of real crisis. He was in crisis, a psychological crisis, during his confrontation with the unconscious, and he found himself doing these drawings, just spontaneously doing drawing after drawing of mandalas, of these circular, centering, symmetrical drawings. I've had analysans who found themselves doing drawings of circles that we were later able to say, well, yes, that's a mandala. And I know you've had an experience with a kind of spontaneous arising of mandalas. And so maybe that's a great place also just to ground this, because it can get kind of heady and intellectual.
Oh, sure. This is a story about our moving to New York. This was quite a few years back, 25 or more years back. I was just overwhelmed by New York, all the noise and the busyness and just so much sensory input and for me, overload. And we lived in Brooklyn. And somehow one day, when I was feeling especially dislocated and kind of confused, I noticed a manhole cover, and it was a Con Ed manhole cover. There are a gazillion of them all over New York, and they have a real mandala, circles and circles and circles pattern within the big circle of the manhole cover. And all of a sudden, one day, I noticed it. And it's a great example of how an archetype, a mandala, circular forms, wholeness, can be embedded in a specific image, from the great to the concrete. And it lit me up. So talk about sort of a symbol of transformation, one of the titles of Jung's works. I embarked on a passionate quest for manhole covers with my faithful camera. Before cell phones could take pictures, that's how deep in the past it was. Mm-hmm. And I also discovered, because we were in Brooklyn, these coal chute covers. And there are, I don't know how many patterns. I got a book eventually that said there were 256 different manhole coal chute patterns I think in New York. And then I got into Jungian training, and the first paper I ever wrote was on manhole covers as mandalas. And my story really is about how something can arise that has been there, of course, all the time, that has a special quality to it and can change our attitude in a radical way.
So that's a great story, because it's not like the people that made the manhole covers were like, okay, let's reach into archetypal symbolism and make a mandala out of this. It was something that was kind of an unconscious product in a way, but it spoke to you at a time of disorientation and dislocation, of centering and wholeness.
And this centering and wholeness really was, these wonderful designs. I imagine that these round covers just demanded to be embellished and designed and enjoyed by, all the people who made them. But of course, underneath, they connect with the underworld of coal delivery or sewers. So They were a wonderful symbol of linking the above and the below. And so there was a kind of connection in that symbol and in me because I was so lit up by manhole covers. The paper was called What Lies Beneath. It enabled me to start really dealing with some of the muck in me that had been churned up in moving to New York.
What I love about the manhole cover also, Deb, is how substantive it is. For those of you that have been to New York, these enormous metal plates are incredibly heavy. They're designed to have these enormous trucks, machinery drive over them safely. That to get into the underworld is a process, as is true in mythology. It wasn't that somebody could just decide to jump into the underworld. They had to go through a lot of stuff to find it, and then they were challenged.
For one day, you're going to have to stop traffic.
Yeah, exactly. There's labor involved in getting to the underworld that I think is so wonderfully captured there.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the guys lift a manhole cover. There's a whole process for it. And the reason that they're round is that they cannot fall into the hole. A square cover or a rectangular cover can fall into the hole, and that would be pretty darn hard to get out again. So there's something in that, too, of the stability, the permanence, the staying power of a circle.
One of the things I love about your experience, particularly in the context of Jungians talking together, is it's so easy for us to get rather esoteric and abstract rather quickly. And archetypal is something that lends itself to abstraction and philosophy and so on. And your manhole experience is the exact opposite of that. There's nothing abstract about a manhole and a manhole cover. It's absolutely practical, and it's right there. And archetypes, when they present themselves to us, often present themselves in the most practical and mundane way. But they also can carry an enormous sort of numinous power that moves us very deeply. You got captivated somehow by the manhole as a way of entering New York City and perhaps as a way of entering your psyche, so that another aspect of the archetypal as it relates to symbolic imagery is that it doesn't have a single meaning. A sign has a single meaning. If you see a red light and a red traffic light, you stop. If you see a yellow traffic light, you press on the gas pedal. And if you see I don't
think that's what you're supposed to do.
But signs are something they say simply, they have a single message that they want to deliver to you clearly. A symbol, and an archetypal symbol, is in a way the exact opposite. Its richness comes from the diversity or multiplicity of meaning that comes to it. I suspect that the meaning of the manhole to you over time must have gotten more and more complex and with greater and greater emotional depth. Was that your experience as you studied?
Absolutely. I think at first there was a sense of it really drew me out into New York because I had to hunt for new designs on manhole covers. So and also, of course, it was grounding because as I was walking around, I was looking for this one specific thing. My eyes were on the sidewalk. And then I got very interested in sewers. You know, there are labyrinths of sewers underneath Paris and underneath all kinds of cities and how the water flows. So it enabled me symbolically in thinking about reading about sewers, exactly what you said, Tom, of, excavating some of my own unconscious subterranean sewer-like material. It really led me on, and this is a kind of a long story, but just it does illustrate how a symbol has that kind of life-giving power.
We seem to have a sort of New York City street theme going on, so I'm just going to pick it up and carry it along. I also moved to New York at a time of significant personal disruption. I was 27 going on 28, which was an important year for me. And I moved there, and I would say I very quickly got quite depressed, actually, shortly after moving there. And I started having dream after dream after dream after dream taking place in the subway. And at this point, I wasn't a therapist. I wasn't interested in Jung, but here I was. I had moved to New York for graduate school, and I was going through an archetypal descent.
Mm-hmm.
And my dreams showed me that in this image of the subway. I was going underground. I was going into the unconscious. And so there it is again, the way that an archetypal theme, like a descent to the underworld, shows up in someone's life and in everyday images.
My favorite quote about image and archetype and its relation to the Jungian endeavor actually comes from Meister Eckhart, who lived from 1260 to 1328. So he was a pre-Jungian Jungian, or Jung was a post-Eckhartian Eckhartian. Eckhart wrote, when the soul wants to experience something, she throws out an image in front of her and then steps into it. And I think both both of your underground experiences are the subways and the sewers and the manholes. The images led you where the soul wanted you to go, if you will. I think that's what ARAS is all about, is following those images that have appeared cross-culturally and throughout time that express the soul's journey and lead us into that journey in greater depth. That's really what ARAS is all about.
That's really lovely, Tom. It's just beautifully said, and it's exactly right. I mean, after all, we'd been in New York I don't know how many months, but 6, 7, 8 months. The manhole covers had presumably been there all along. And then they sprang up at me. That's where the soul wanted to go. Down. And isn't that mythic? The descent of Persephone, for example, who, as you would know more than any of us probably, from your interest in Greek culture and myth, she was abducted, taken down into Hades. It's really one of the classic stories about a descent and a depression. And I think most all of us have had some kind of depressive period in our lives. And if we can see it as a descent, it helps. And if it can be imaged, symbolized by a myth or a subway or a manhole cover, we have a way to work with it. It takes it from just being sort of this vague malaise to something that has story, something that has image, something that has life in it.
This reminds me back to maybe Joseph's original question about what is an archetype. And one of the definitions, this is a definition that I like best, was offered, I think, by John Perry. And he called an archetype an affect image. And it's quite beautiful in its simplicity, because it says an archetypal image or an archetype has two components. It has the image which draws us into it, but it also has affect, which is deep emotion. It's not just feeling, it's deep emotion. So that the combination of affect and image makes for archetypal reality, if you will. And one of the things he said that I always found interesting with regard to depression, in very serious depressions, what you get is only the affect, and often people in very serious depressions, they can't find the image. There is no image. It's all affect. And what both you, Deb, and Lisa were describing was your depressions were sort of part of life's journey. And fortunately, there was not only feeling malaise and so on, but there was also the image that led you forward. So it's the combination of the two that can be life-saving in that way.
And Donald Kalshed, who we've had on the podcast and who works with trauma, really talked about how in trauma, affect and image get split apart. And so your point about how the two together are what lead us forward is there an image for the affect? Because then it has meaning. Then we have something we can work with.
So, Tom, we've talked a little bit about how archetypes, which are invisible, can inspire many different imagistic representations of themselves. If we take Lisa's example of the mother, there are innumerable specific permutations of motherly figures, but because they all share a typicality, the brain has a tendency to group them together. This also goes in part to evolutionary biology and the way humans developed the ability to recognize patterns and to group them together in psyche so that we could create pockets of meaning for ourselves. And that had all kinds of benefits for human beings. And of course, Jung suggests that we inherit these kind of groupings of meanings, which probably helps us survive, for that matter. But one of the things that I'm interested in and keep my eye on is that we're in a culture that's flooded with images right now. I mean, in an unprecedented way.
Yes.
When I think
absolutely.
back to the ancient world, or fantasize my way back there, being the average peasant someplace, there were probably very small number of art images, for instance, that you might have access to in a small village. Or the sensory impressions were really the primary place that you were taking little mental snapshots of one's life. But now, and with the introduction of artificial intelligence, where people are just creating new images all the time, we're flooded with images, and I think people are overwhelmed by them. So how does ARAS discern what they will or won't put in their collection? So that there's millions of images of a topic. But what is it that the ARAS scholars see that says that's one of the images that is an excellent representation of the archetype?
Well, that's such a beautiful statement you just made, Joseph, about the difference between what we imagine an older life would have been with probably fewer images and certainly not the flooding of images that we get today. And then how do we discriminate when we're flooded with so many images? How do we discriminate those that have meaning and don't? It reminds me now, if you go to the movie theater, they always tell you the movie starts at 7:10 and you get there at 7:10 and you're flooded with 20 minutes of previews of these ghastly images of enormous destructions, usually cars flipping over and planes blowing up and these superhero myths and all this garbage, and you're flooded for 20 minutes while you wait for a movie that you really want to see. And we are absolutely flooded with imagery today. It reminds me of when I was much younger and Fellini was making his movies. And Fellini's movies at the time seemed like they were flooding you with imagery because they were so full of fantasy, but they seem like Fellini's movies now seem like they're slow motion compared to the rapidity with which we're flooded with images. So it does raise the question that you raise, which is how do we discriminate between images that have enduring meaning or that touch us deeply and the more almost computer-generated flooding of images. The first word that came to mind was intuition. This is probably a type. Jung was very famous for his typology, among other things. This is probably reflecting of my own typology, but intuition is that capacity to see the whole of something and to a sensate kind of person would be able to describe to you in great detail all the specifics of the image, whereas an intuitive type might not be able to tell you the color of the image or anything else, but there's a feeling for the whole, if you will. And for me, what helps me discriminate an archetypal image from just a flooding of imagery would be my intuition. I can sort of see the whole of it, and then it links with feeling, and I'm moved by it. So it's the fullness of the image and the motion that moves me. And it doesn't have to be by a well-known artist. A child can do an archetype, maybe probably does more archetypal images than artists do. They spontaneously arise. The other thing that came to mind when you were speaking, Joseph, was about what the ancients saw in their world. And we love Greek sculpture now because of the pristine whiteness of it, the purity of the sculpture. But actually, there's now a general consensus that when people went to the Parthenon, so all of these fabulous white pristine cultures were actually painted in very gaudy colors, quite moving, but beautiful colors, so that there was what we now yearn for is kind of a pristine whiteness, if you will. And what maybe the ancient needed was the vibrancy of color to bring the imagination alive. So I guess the point there is that what's archetypal in one age may not be in another age, or it may shift over time. What we perceive as archetypal today is probably culturally determined, so that the flooding of imagery that we're all subjected to means probably that an archetypal image does just the opposite of the feeling of being flooded. It probably brings up a single deep emotion that's quite clear and maybe needs no color to move us. This is just, but I'd love to hear what you all think about how you recognize an archetypal image.
Yeah, I think you've just said it so well, and we're back to affect and image. And of course, that's what our dreams are. Affect and image of what moves us, what gets our attention, what really resonates beyond just the flow of sound and visual content. And we all know. I think we all have a sense for the real.
You know, Tom, I love that sort of foray into an exploration of, does archetypal imagery change over time, and how do we relate to it in different cultures? And I mean, in some sense, this is what ARAS catalogs. And I'm wondering, could you just tell us the story of ARAS?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. We've been sort of talking about what ARAS is trying to do, and maybe now we can get a bit more concrete about what ARAS is. And first of all, ARAS originates in something called ARANOS, and ARANOS was a series of seminars that were started by Olga Frida Kapton, who collaborated with Jung in forming the ARANOS lectures, which began in the early 30s, and they were relatively short-lived because the war came along. But what Frida did was she started collecting imagery to go along with the themes of the ARANOS lecture for that year. The one that we maybe know the best would be Erich Neumann did a book called The Great Mother. And The Great Mother was based on the ARANOS collection of images that Frida collected for the ARANOS series, for that summer series of lectures. So it was a series of lectures given by very well-known scholars of Egyptology and China, and Karenyi was from Greece, and these wonderful sort of offbeat scholars who were studying archetypal imagery, if you will, around the world, and they collected images to demonstrate or bring the lectures alive. The war came along, and after the war, the collection was given to the Warburg Institute in London, which was a collection of very esoteric images put together by a man named Warburg, who came from the Warburg Rothschild family and had a huge amount of money, which he dedicated to the study of symbolic imagery. Another copy was made and sent to New York. So the original ARAS images went to London and New York. And in New York, it developed in its own way, supported by a couple of foundations, including Mary Mellon and the Bollingen Foundation. Mary Mellon was married to Paul Mellon, who was from an enormously wealthy American family, and she had analyzed with Jung, and she endowed the Bollingen Foundation. And the Bollingen Foundation was very generous to the early ARAS collection. And a woman in New York named Jessie Fraser started developing the original ARAS images into this collection, which grew to 18,000 images. And then Joe Henderson came along and developed a schema for how to catalog and organize the images. And he did it on the basis of personal, cultural, and archetypal. And so that he created a kind of way of thinking about imagery that spoke to the personal, the artist who created it, if you will, the cultural, which would be the context in which the image arose, the cultural context, and then the archetypal, that unknowable level. And so the collection was built on these three layers and cataloged accordingly. What's quite interesting in the early history of ARAS is that, or of ARAS, excuse me, it's easy to get confused between ARAS and Warburg and ARAS, but the ARAS originated really in New York, and then San Francisco and Los Angeles institutes participated. Originally, the Jungian tradition, as you all know, was rather esoteric. The Freudians were really the dominant psychoanalytic tradition in the United States, and Jung was considered a crackpot. And
still is in some circles.
In some circles, and you could only gain admission to the ARAS library if your analyst wrote you a letter, and then you could go to this secret place that held the images that told your story, your archetypal story. Well, that version of ARAS is very different from where ARAS is today.
Let me just ask you, because I'm curious about this. I mean, I lived in New York for a number of years, and I think I'm familiar with where ARAS is actually located. So, is it actually a repository of physical images, like I guess photographs of, ancient sculptures and paintings and all kinds of things, right? It's almost like a sort of a library where you could go and look at these. Is that correct?
That's what it used to be, which was there were filing cabinets filled with files that had each image. It had a picture of the image, and then it had the cultural context and the origin of the artist and a description of the art, and then an archetypal commentary. And it was a paper-based archive in files. And then what we did in about 2000, and we had a big fight about this. It was really a great fight.
Nothing quite like a Jungian fight.
They're always better when you can tell them in hindsight than when you're right in the middle of them.
Yes, I'm sure.
I was living in California, and of course we were flooded with the newness of technology and the promise of technology. And I saw the opportunity to digitize the collection, which was to digitize it and then put the whole thing online. And we raised some money in around 2000, and we digitized the entire collection. We sent the whole collection to India because it was less expensive and they were better at it, to digitize the entire collection of 18,000 images, plus all of the text, which was had to be typed out again, and the whole thing was digitized. So we digitized the entire collection beginning in about, I think it was 2002 or so. So now ARAS is fundamentally an online collection, which means that monthly we have people from 135 different countries that sign on to ARAS to look for archetypal imagery. So it's become from a very esoteric little library on the third floor of the Jung Foundation building on 39th Street in Washington, D.C. It's now internationally available online as a digitized collection. we did preserve, we actually photocopied all of the original files. And if you go online, you can not only see them in the new digitized form, but you can actually also go and see images of the original files.
So anyone can become a member of ARAS at the website and have access to this incredible trove of images. Isn't that right?
Well, it's half right.
Okay.
There are portions of the archive which are free, and I can tell there are a lot of wonderful things that are for free on the archive. The archive itself requires a membership because we're a nonprofit, and it's pretty expensive to do things like this. So we have a subscription fee for access to the archive itself, and then we have a whole series of things that are available for free in the non-subscription part of the archive.
People go to ARAS.org. All the information is right there.
All the information is right there. We've grown so much in the 20 years that we've been online that there's a tremendous amount of information on the archive, different things that you can do with it, different activities that we sponsor, different subjects that we get interested in and create programs in. So it's become a very multi-purpose vehicle of allowing people access to symbolic imagery from around the world in the beginning of time. I mean, it's extremely ambitious. Did you all read The Bead Game by Hermann Hesse? That probably dates me. In The Bead Game, there's this imaginary place where all of the knowledge from all of the world is contained in one place. And there's a very elaborate philosophical game that determines life on the earth in this wonderful imaginative novel by Hermann Hesse. Sometimes I think of ARAS as being a kind of image-based bead game in which we're collecting all of the symbolic imagery from around the world and then allowing people to begin their own journey in that as they're stimulated by a dream or a painting or a historical event or a contemporary event. And then ARAS tries to allow that individual to thread their way through the symbolic imagery over time and culture to explore the many levels of meaning that go with a symbolic image.
It's so synchronistic that you mentioned Hermann Hesse, because when you were talking about how carefully and protectively the original archive was kept, it reminded me of Journey to the East, which is a Hermann Hesse novel where this initiate who abandoned the secret order fights their way to finally get into the great library of all occult knowledge, only to discover that he never learned the codes to decipher any of it. So he was totally incompetent to understand anything. And I suppose that's true for us with archetypal imagery, that while we have an instinct to recognize that an image is particularly potent, there is a kind of decoding process, that there is an attitude towards imagery that has to be learned and cultivated and encouraged, as you were just saying. I also think that there's a way in which the collective psyche does a little bit of that for us. And I think that happens when an image goes viral, where all of a sudden a single photograph begins to fly everywhere, and it seems that millions of people are having a kind of congruent emotional reaction to it, and how that can tip the culture in a way. I remember a while back, there was this tragic image of a young child, a toddler, who had died as a group of families were trying to escape persecution and had washed up on the shore. And we're all nodding because we all know that photograph. There was something about that photograph that just rushed through the collective and created this enormous emotional reaction and mobilized the collective in a certain way. I guess I'm just thinking out loud that there's a way in which we're noticing what's archetypal by noticing what's viral. And by that I mean what what the collective really grabs onto and passes all around. And then there's a certain kind of arcane philosophical tradition where people are trained to learn to recognize archetypal dynamics and to imagine what their impact is. And that ARAS is sitting in that holding place, both as educator and initiator, but also as the curator of what becomes the dominant in the culture. And I was thinking, Tom, that you have a very particular interest in that intersection between culture and archetype and symbol, and ARAS has put a number of those things out. I was reflecting on the document that you wrote and created about the Ukrainian war, and that's very much that intersection between these various levels. And you talked about the way these images are affecting us in three different axes, that some of the images have to do with these archetypal defenses that activate within the Ukrainian culture in order to try to galvanize the spirit of the people. Then there is a mythopoetic dimension to it. And then another axis is the way various layers of the psyche are also embedded in the images. And this is an area of wisdom and analysis that you have a particular interest in. Because all of us are still reeling with these images about the war in Ukraine, what would you like to say about that project, how it affected you, what you think its value is in the collective?
First of all, I want to speak just a moment to the educational function of ARAS, because for many people, they may today be hearing about ARAS for the first time, and we've used a lot of words to describe it. We have a program, the ARAS Teen Program. It actually is centered exclusively in New York at this point, where we take a series of teenagers, we take a group of teenagers and educate them in how to explore the world symbolically. And part of it is walking around the streets of Manhattan and recognizing the symbols in the everyday. And I'm hoping we'll include the manhole in that in the future, so that we have an educational function. And one of the things we did to make this more available is we created, I think, a wonderful program called, it's actually online and it's free. It's called A Journey Through Symbols, Your Guide to Exploring the Imagination. That's available for free on the ARAS. And it's a wonderful introduction to the educative function of ARAS, because most of us aren't given the code to decodify images. The only person I ever knew who really had the code was Joe Henderson. I think he was born with it, and he could look at an image, and it's as if he already had the language of symbolic imagery. He inherited it, and he looked at an image, and it just started to flow out. Most of us don't have that, and most of us need to be educated in it. Then the second, to me, very important issue you bring up is how a symbolic image can move us individually. For instance, Deb's wonderful story of the manhole, or Lisa's story of the subway, where there's an experience as a person of being drawn into the symbolic at a time of disorientation. That's a symbolic individual journey. But we also now are on this unbelievable collective psychic journey because of the internet and the viral exposure to very potent images. I think that was a child in Greece. I think it was a child that was, fleeing from Syria and was taking a boat, and the boat overturned. I remember that image well. So it's a perfect example. There's another story it brought to mind, which was Elian Gonzalez, who was fleeing Cuba. I wrote about him. I was very moved by that. He was in a boat that overturned, and his mother drowned, and he was saved. And then his relatives in Florida wanted to keep him in Florida, and his father was in Cuba and wanted him to return to Cuba. And Al Gore got involved in that. It became part of the presidential election. What was going to happen with Elian Gonzalez, this child who had heroically survived almost drowning? And that was another image that became viral at another time. But speaking more directly to the Ukraine-Russian collage that I created, I do believe that symbolic images are enormously influential in how the collective psyche is mobilized for good purposes and manipulated for destructive purposes.
Absolutely.
Because there's such powerful emotion in imagery, and smart propagandists can use that imagery to activate the collective psyche and the archetypal level of the collective psyche. What I was trying to do in that, I had done something, I had done another image, Joseph, actually somebody else had done it in response to an article I had written on the war, the Iraqi war, and our hunting Osama bin Laden and the Bush-Osama bin Laden pairing, and how leaders can take on, they become symbolic of the spirit of a nation. Osama bin Laden became symbolic of the spirit of a group of people, and George Bush became, and they paired off against one another. And then you get this archetypal negative pairing, which I used a couple of snakes paired off against one another. That would be the serpentine archetypal level of destructive confrontation. And I think images are often used in the collective psyche to move us, particularly to motivate us to get enraged at groups of people that we see as our adversaries. And I think in the Ukraine-Iraqi war, in the Ukraine, you get so confused, the Ukraine-Russian war, I got very interested in the image of how the mother goddess became the great, the spirit of the Ukrainian people, and the mother goddess, a different one, became the spirit of the Russian people. And in the name of the mother goddess of the Holy Land, this terrible war is being conducted. It raised for me, and then you get what I call archetypal defenses, where these monstrous things are done to people on both sides because you've mobilized that collective spirit through symbolic imagery. And how do we diffuse that? How do these archetypal defenses, is there something we can do about them when they get activated in the collective psyche? How, in the United States right now, we're right in the middle of this. I mean, we're totally, whether it be around abortion or whether it be around blacks and whites, or the polarization in our country is basically the manipulation of symbolic images to get people to fight with and hate one another.
Yeah.
And
so we're back to that image of the riverbed.
Yes.
And how when these forces are released, they can inundate us in ways that we don't have conscious control over.
Donald Trump did it with the wall, in building the wall in between the border of the United States and Mexico. That the image of the wall became very potent as a divisive force in our political process, just as the image of the mask during COVID became a very potent symbolic image dividing those who were pro-vaccination and those who were against vaccination. So symbolic images are used to activate deep feeling, which is often unmanageable.
So an awareness of symbolic imagery and how powerful it is really, really important, right? Especially right now. Yes,
and I fear for it because I think sometimes the archetypal affect is much more powerful than our rational capacities to understand it and do something about it. Sometimes I think Jung, in that quote that Deb gave earlier about the water course, he said when nations start to collide like that, nothing stops it until a force greater than itself gets in the way. So what's going to stop it in Ukraine and Russia? What's going to stop that? Or what's going to stop it in the United States around abortion or around racism or around any number of things that divide us?
I find myself thinking about, as you were saying, the incredible potency that archetypal imagery has on the collective and on a nation. It can rise up spontaneously, as you were saying. For the French, it was the goddess Nike, who was, he was embedded there in the Arc de Triomphe, protecting the integrity of the French spirit. There's Mother Russia, and all the depictions of that. And you were pointing out in Ukraine this image of freedom, mother freedom, and the way that has and can be manipulated. We've mentioned this a little bit before on the podcast, in part because I was so impressed with this, but Edward Bernays, who was Freud's nephew and went through Freud's work and found a way to operationalize that, and is the father of modern marketing. This ability to have a sense of some dominant archetypal images or principles that are really active in a culture, and being able to manipulate people into associating that with certain behaviors. His famous campaign was to convince women to begin smoking through this phallic symbolism that he became aware of, and the use of power as a motivator to purchase something.
And freedom.
And freedom.
That women were free and were declaring themselves autonomous and liberated by smoking cigarettes.
There is also a very disturbing narrative that Joseph Goebbels, who was the propagandist for the Nazi regime, was very influenced by Bernays' book and use of archetypal imagery in order to sway a culture. And that was part of the decisive efforts to mobilize the German culture in this kind of Wotan, murdering, scapegoating direction. So that's this kind of nefarious application of this ancient wisdom. What I was really interested in your essay on the archetypal defenses of the group spirit, that there are times where these archetypal images will rise up to protect and defend and facilitate the cohesion of a community that is under attack. And I think that that's not a topic that is brought forward as much. I generally am more disturbed by the misapplication of that, the nefarious application. But you were really talking about the benefit, the saving power of certain kinds of images, and how important it is. So I'm wondering, in American culture at this time, because we're in a big flux around a lot of things, Tom, do you have a sense of images that are rising up that are trying to protect the American psyche, to sustain its integrity, and to resist this warping manipulation that propagandists are bombarding American cultural psyche with?
I'm more in tune with the manipulation of archetypal images right now than I am with the positive evocation of archetypal images defending the spirit of who we are. But what does come to mind, I was very aware prior to the outbreak of the war between Russia and Ukraine that the threat of authoritarianism around the world seemed to be becoming more and more dominant, and that maybe the age of democracy as we know it, at least at its best, was very much in decline for economic forces, because of economic forces and other things. And you certainly see that in the alliance perhaps between China and Russia. Many countries have experienced a very right-wing authoritarian movement, which maybe comes up in the face of tremendous fear of uncertainty and the need for sort of rigid structures to allow people to fall back on, like Make America Great Again. There's an image of a halcyon time in American society when things were much better. They probably were much better for many, certainly white working class people. What surprised me, I'm not so sure if I see a specific image, but what surprised me, particularly in Joe Biden's response to, and I'll get political here for a minute, response to the war in Ukraine and Russia, was the sort of unbelievable and totally unexpected upsurge of a spirit of defending a democratic order. Now, it may be capitalistic, and it may be, you could argue that it's really not democracy that the spirit's rising up in, that it's a capitalistic thing. But I think the spirit of democracy was in great jeopardy. And I've been amazed at the level of collective emotion, how the war in Ukraine, perhaps because the Ukrainian people themselves exhibited such courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Everybody counted them out right from the beginning. And they just didn't give in. They fought a war they were fighting a war of independence. And they mobilized our spirit, perhaps the spirit of the Western world, to rise up in a way that I think we were all frightened that kind of democracy as we knew it was really on the decline. So there has been a huge emergence of the defense of the democratic spirit that we're right in the middle of right now. I drive down the street from one of my daughter's house, and on a tree there's a Ukrainian flag hanging on a redwood tree. Well, that's a symbol. Who would have imagined a Ukrainian flag hanging on a redwood tree in Mill Valley, California? Or who would imagine Black Lives Matter signs hanging? So that these symbolic images, in the flag, of course, is a primary symbolic image of the spirit of a land and the defense of that spirit. So that would be an example, I think, Joseph, of something emerging in the collective psyche and how unexpected it was. Unexpected.
And related to that is the symbol of the sunflower. Ukraine being the foremost exporter of sunflower seeds, that you're seeing the Ukrainian flag, but also the image of the sunflower, which is an ancient symbol of the human spirit being oriented to the divine, in as much as large as sunflowers are, over the course of a day, the head of the sunflower will move and track the position of the sun and always stay facing the sun. So it just occurs to me as we're talking, the incredible inspiring beauty of that image, although I don't know that anyone's talked about it that I've read in that particular way. But if the archetypes are real, that there's something of that feeling and thought embedded in the image of the sunflower, whether or not it's obvious at an ego level.
So it seems to me that there's something here of in democracy around self-determination that's related to individuation, and that is the spirit, and the sunflower is another symbol of that, that something wants to live fully and manifest fully. A spirit of cultural wholeness and self-determination, just as for us as individuals, we want to become and grow into what we were innately meant to be, rather than having external forces, exert a kind of crushing force on us.
The first media revolution, or at least one of the early media revolutions, happened in the 15th century with the invention of the printing press. And what followed on from there was a great period of war and disruption in European culture, in any case. And historians have pointed out that this is probably connected. There were lots of religious wars. There was the Reformation. There was the 100 Years' War that followed the invention of the printing press. And the relationship between these is that then ideas could flow more freely. And it gave rise to lots of disruption. It seems to me that we're living through something similar to that now with the advent of the internet. But the interesting difference between the printing press and the internet is the printing press primarily communicated words. The internet is really a medium of words, yes, but even more so of images. And words can communicate ideas, and ideas are powerful. But images, I think, are also very powerful in a way that subverts conscious awareness. And Tom, as you were saying, we can be affected without even really understanding how or why we're affected or in what direction. Joseph, in answer to your question, one of the things that's occurred to me is how often the image of the sort of the young feminine savior appears. And I just noticed that if you look at a lot of movies, that's the theme. I'm thinking of the film Whale Rider that now is maybe 10 or 15 years old. But in the story, the village is kind of waiting for a kind of a savior figure who is assumed will be a boy or a man. And in fact, it's this young woman who's able to have this connection with the whale, which of course could be considered an image of the self. And that's just one film where that motif comes up. There's so many films like that. It comes up a fair amount of the films of Miyazaki. And I just wonder, is that a spontaneous arising of a new pattern? I mean, Jung pointed out that is maybe what was happening when people started seeing UFOs, that there was a new archetypal image that was making its way into the collective because it was meeting this need that the collective had at the time.
All of that, I think, is so relevant. Yeah.
Maybe one of the things ARAS is trying to do is to make our understanding of symbolic imagery more conscious, not for the purpose of intellectualizing it, but for the purpose of realizing its potential benefits and its potential dangers. And one of the things ARAS has really been, over the last 20 years, we've really been wanting to bring our notions of symbolic imagery more out into the world rather than to be a more esoteric thing for only people who got permission from their analysts to go use it. We wanted to bring ARAS into the world.
And we give you all permission to use it.
Everybody's got permission now. And one of the things we've done, we're always looking for ways that symbolic imagery is emerging spontaneously in culture. And there's an organization called With Ukrainian Jungians. It was started by a group in England. And we ended up collaborating with them by, one, hosting all of the wonderful seminars that they're producing, but also we've created a gallery where people can submit images about what the images that come to their mind or their psyche based on what's happening in the Ukraine and Russia. And so we've created a gallery of people that if you have an image that's really moved you about the war, you could submit it to ARAS and it would be put online and it would be part of a collective gallery that we're spontaneously creating in response to individuals who are deeply moved by the war. So rather than trying to flood people with images, we're trying to let people have their own images and then contribute them. And that would be a kind of different sort of sharing of symbolic imagery that is different from the flooding. It's a discriminated curatorial attitude towards images around specific topics. I think it's a really unique, and we did the same thing during COVID. We created an image-based gallery where people from around the world could contribute images that COVID was evoking in them. So we're trying to not only be educating in the world, but receiving from the world in terms of the images that are moving people.
Tom, are you seeing, pursuant to Lisa's comment, images of the feminine emerging?
I'm just thinking about the gallery, the Ukrainian gallery, and I think there are a lot of images of the feminine. Yes, I think probably most of the people submitting images are women, and I think there are a lot of images of and about women, often as either victims of or heroes in the midst of these really disturbing ordeals that we're all either directly experiencing or indirectly experiencing. I think it's the spontaneous emergence of because I think I don't know how spontaneous it is, because I think there's such a strong and powerful and good movement towards seeing women as being capable of all sorts of things, heroism and kindness and compassion. And so maybe it's spontaneous, or it's just the collective psyche. That's where it's going at this point.
Mm-hmm.
China, in terms of the Gutenberg Press and the release of ideas and the fact that we're in a new world because of the internet and the reliance on imagery. I'm reading a book now on China, and they became so frightened by Tiananmen Square and by the collapse of the economy in 2008 that they're terrified of the internet and the capacity for new ideas to be spread and the potential disruption to their society. So they're censoring it in all sorts of ways.
And speaking of images and Tiananmen Square, that image of the man standing in front of the line of tanks is, I think, another one of those images that just seized the collective and communicated an archetypal truth.
I'm thinking about the image of Nike. And, it's above one of which gate is it, Joseph, in Paris?
It's inside the Arc de Triomphe, yeah.
That is a feminine spirit that symbolizes victory. And it's a very interesting symbol of, of course, we all know about the company, but a combination, it seems to me, of, assertiveness and activation and agency that is linked with the feminine.
When we were producing the Book of Symbols, which I think there were over 400 images, one of the reasons we had such a difficult time finding a publisher was that to get the rights to reproduce images, I think the cost was $300,000 to get the permission rights for that. And there's a woman named Robin Jaquia who was an analyst, a Jungian analyst, whose husband was the head attorney for Nike. And so Nike gave us, or through Robin Jaquia, $300,000 to get the permissions for the images in the Book of Symbols. So there's a connection between Nike and a woman and the Book of Symbols.
Yeah.
Tom, one of the things that I'm suddenly aware of, comes in and out of my mind, is an archetypal resurgence in Chinese culture, which I think is a reaction, which is the rise of the cult of the moon goddess in Chinese culture. That part of the Cultural Revolution was this wiping out of the ancient history of the Chinese, the various religious imagery and practices, and to create this very unified and rationalistic communist culture. But rather spontaneously, the celebration of the moon goddess, whose name I will probably mispronounce, Chang'e, is now showing up despite government protest. Her images are returning, celebrations are happening all around China, and there is some tolerance for the re-emergence of this in Chinese media. So this may be another possible example that Lisa Deb, you were bringing up, of the feminine rising up spontaneously and archetypally in a psyche that has become overly rationalistic and, in a sense, I would say, cruel. So it's an interesting phenomena that I think might apply to this.
It brings to mind, Joseph, I'm not familiar with that cult emerging in China, but what it does bring to mind is another project that we've been pursuing at ARAS, which is called Gaia Then and Now. And of course, Gaia is the mother goddess, and Gaia is also the name of the ancient Greek mother goddess, but Gaia also is the name of a theory about the interconnection of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. And so it's a modern re-emergence of Gaia, if you will. And one of the things that we've been doing on ARAS over the last couple of years is we've produced a series of, so far, 6 or 7 different webinars on Gaia as she appeared 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, and Gaia as she's appearing now in modern scientific theory and also in modern dance and in modern art, so that it would be a corollary, I think, of what you're talking about, the moon, the cult of the moon goddess in China, that there is an emergence of goddess psychology in the most positive sense. These webinars that we've produced on Gaia, again, they're free on ARAS. Some of them are just gorgeous in terms of the imagery. And Jules Cashford she's probably the preeminent Jungian mythologist. She wrote a great book on the moon, perhaps the best book on the symbolism of the moon, and she's done a couple of the shows. We just recently had a fellow, Stephen Harding, who looks at the tree of life from 3 different perspectives: the alchemical perspective, the modern scientific perspective, and the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, and he does it all through imagery. It's this exploration of image and psyche and affect and symbol and archetype to inform us about maybe the most positive directions we might take, as well as the most destructive directions we might take.
I just want to comment on something. Joseph, you're talking about the Chinese moon goddess, and Tom, you were talking about this wonderful imagery of Gaia. And one of the ways that these archetypal images emerge in the culture is compensatory, right? They bring what is needed. They bring what is lacking, and that can happen in a person's life as well. Deb, you were feeling disoriented, and what emerged were these images of orientation and wholeness. So the moon goddess in China maybe reasserts, I don't know much about that mythology, but I know a bit about lunar imagery, reasserts the importance of that which is implicit or that which is intuitive or kind of in the darkness a little bit, rather than too much that's kind of rational or Apollonian or kind of coming down from on high. That would seem potentially to be a very important corrective or compensatory energy to a certain kind of culture.
It also seems to me that ARAS itself is compensatory of what a treasure trove. One of Jung's famous phrases that lit me up in early years is the treasure hard to attain. And, I was dying to know what that treasure was. I wanted some of it. And I am thinking today that the treasure in some ways is hard to attain, but one way to go looking for it is at ARAS, ARAS.com. It offers treasure.
Well, that's a really nice plug, and I have to follow up on that because I wrote an essay that I really had fun with on ARAS as being a modern ark, like Noah's Ark. And it's about and of course the ark comes when we're being flooded. And today we're being flooded by imagery. And so we need an ark of imagery that actually speaks to us in depth. And so I think of ARAS as being the treasure, this treasure of symbolic imagery through time, and that it is a modern ark in the flood of imagery that is too much.
That's great. It is aras.org, not .com, though we do want to make sure we send you to the right place.
Something that comes up to me as well, Tom, in terms of the role of Eros and the role of archetypal symbolism and Jungian orientation to it, is a political and ecological movement called enchantivism, which is something that's kind of moved around in the back of my head. It is a movement to rekindle a sense of enchantment with the natural world. And that if people could feel that, which is really an activation of that mythopoetic layer relative to nature, that they would then respond differently. They would make different choices. And that goes to the Gaia re-emergence, that if we can feel that the planet is a living being, an intelligence, that will evoke different responses and behaviors. If the moon goddess returns and is celebrated every autumn as an irrepressible reality that can't be governmentally extracted from the soul, it gives us a sense of re-enchantment. And I think that is yet another lens that we could use to discuss the positive impact of archetypes and archetypal imagery. And even for you, Deb, I was raised in Long Island, but spent plenty of time in Manhattan. There's a way in which manhole covers are ubiquitous, ignored, maybe even dismissed, but in some way your psyche enchanted the manhole covers and raised them to a new kind of valence and meaning. So it just occurs to me that that's another way of thinking about the role of this archetypal sensibility.
I love that.
Yeah, I do too. I think it's beautiful, and it reminds me so much of what we live with after the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution was the disenchantment of the world, which was made rational, and we could understand its processes, but somehow the soul got taken away from the enchanting quality of our being enchanted with the world. You still see it in children before they've been rationalized or whatever. But I do know in Freudian psychology, wish fulfillment was kind of a dirty word in a way, because wish fulfillment was that part of the more primitive psyche where, to kind of compensate for whatever pain or distress you were having, you would have a fantasy that would be a wish fulfillment of something you wanted, even though you couldn't have it. And enchantment was sort of falls under the umbrella of wish fulfillment. You would wish the world to be enchanted, but actually it's not. But this is a much more positive attitude towards enchantment as life affirming and not just a wish fulfillment.
It sounds like re-ensouling.
Yes.
I was also thinking, Tom, about this question which we were bandying about maybe 20 minutes ago, about a somehow archetypal protection around democracy. And I was noodling that over it as we were chatting. And I was wondering about the rise of interest in George Washington. And so I'll bring an example of that. The Twin Towers attack happened in about 2001. Of course, that led to the Iraq War. And that was about the time that the musical Hamilton was being cobbled together. So the book, Alexander Hamilton, was published in 2004, which then inspired the musical that went into development in 2008 and finally, I think, hit Broadway in 2015. It's the story of Hamilton as part of our colonial history, but the central, almost religious figure is George Washington and his farewell speech, which is set to music in a way that's profoundly moving. And so this idea, which happened in New York again, as a kind of reaction, the sense of the spirit of the United States, the scrappiness and the audacity of the founding fathers and their supporters to separate out, to fight, to be free. To me, I think that this was part of that kind of archetypal compensation or a kind of archetypal medicine to come forward. And this is in my mind because I've only recently seen it on Broadway. This happened just this month. And of all the many scene scenarios and musical pieces that were done, Washington's role in the play and the song that he sings about his parting speech just brought the audience to tears, myself included. That just weeping with the this vision of beneficent integrity that Washington used to hold, but I think still does. So I don't know whether that rises to the realm that we're talking about, but I think about the apotheosis of Washington, which is on the Capitol. When you look up and you're visiting the Capitol, there's a dome and there's a circle of clouds and it looks like a bunch of Greek gods. But actually, it's a vision of Washington being translated into this divine effigy who is looking down upon the United States. And Hamilton really re-evokes the spirit of that in a way that I think is in the realm of this.
That's a beautiful recounting of your experience and the time, the cultural context in which it emerged. And it raises a really interesting question because clearly that touches an archetypal experience, maybe even the transformation of Washington from a human to a god, or the resurrection, if you will, or that his rising because he becomes the spirit of the land. He's being renewed as the spirit. And this may sound too theoretical, but it raises a really interesting question to me, which is the relationship between the archetypal and the cultural. I think we tend to only experience the archetypal primarily through the cultural, unless it comes to us in a personal crisis, and it may come in a pure form then. But certainly experience of Washington as an archetypal figure, it's the cultural embodiment of an archetypal spirit, and that fuzzy interface of the two. We began this with trying to define archetypal, and there's a very fuzzy boundary between cultural and archetypal. Lisa did that wonderful thing about salt and in solution, that the archetypal spirit is in solution, and then Washington becomes the crystallization of that in a cultural form. That may sound very theoretical, but it's about this relationship between culture and archetype.
Which speaks so much to the distinction between the archetype and the image that it lives in. And through the image, the archetype then is able to express some of its qualities or expose a culture to some of its qualities. I also think that the archetype of Washington in some ways explains some of the rise of the conservative movement. Because the archetype of Washington and his language that surrounds it is so much about freedom, about defending freedom, about the autonomy of the great experiment of the United States. Part of it that the conservatives do not seem to be listening to, I believe, is that Washington was desperately trying to convince the Congress not to create political parties. He said that he watched that emergence, and in his farewell speech said, "This will be the death of us." This factioning of the political system, that we needed to continue to be a single entity. So it's interesting that the spirit of Washington is pressing itself in small part through the conservative movement, but its full message still hasn't broken out into some of those policies. But maybe it's trying to, because the full story of Washington is actually pretty inspiring.
Tom, I'm wondering if there's anything else you would like to share about ARAS with our listeners.
So maybe what I'll do is just list some of the things that our audience can find on ARAS, some of which may be of interest and some not. One that I didn't mention was an 8-minute and 47-second video of archetypal imagery and music that was created in response to the George Floyd murder, and it's called On Taking a Knee. And it's it's maybe the best single thing ARAS has ever done in terms of putting imagery and sound together to celebrate a very specific moment in culture and in our history, and also place it in archetypal context. It's the most condensed, beautiful, creative thing I think ARAS has done. It's called On Taking a Knee, and Deborah O'Grady was really the one who did that. Other things that people could find on ARAS are the Gaia Then and Now series, which is about the emergence of the goddess 2,000 and 3,000 years ago and how she's now appearing again. We have a wonderful series we're doing with Ukrainian Jungians, which is an ARAS image project on the war between Ukraine and Russia. People can contribute images that move them. We have a beautiful concordance, which I didn't mention. The concordance is something that was created and donated by a member of the ARAS board from Los Angeles, an architect who created, it was $1 million project, and he created a concordance of everything that Jung said in his collected works. So on any topic you want, on any theme, you just enter the word of the subject you're interested in, and the concordance will pull up everything that Jung said about that particular topic. It's a great resource. We have the Pioneer Teen Education Program with a book that we created called A Journey Through Symbols, Your Guide to Exploring the Imagination, which may be the best general introduction to the theme of archetypal symbolic search for anybody. We have Art in a Time of Global Crisis, which was created during COVID, and people from around the world submitted images that spoke to their experience of COVID. We have the archive itself, which has 18,000 images with text, cultural context, archetypal commentary. We have the Book of Symbols. We have the ARAS Connections, which is a quarterly journal which features articles by people from around the world. Hopefully Deb is going to do one on the manhole in New York City. Mm-hmm. And you can subscribe to that for free at newsletter@aras.org. That's enough.
That's a lot.
Tom, I have one more question for you, Tom. What happened inside of you as an individual person or in the environment around you that called you to this mission?
So I lived in a conventional upper middle class or upper class Jewish family in St. Louis, Missouri. My mother was pregnant with twins when I was 8, and she developed serious ulcerative colitis, lost the twins, and had major surgery. And instead of being defeated by it, she started going to classes in art and design at Washington University in St. Louis. And then she started collecting prints and art. And then she started her own art business and collected some of the best American printmakers who were these are Jasper Johns and that whole Rauschenberg. There's a whole group of American artists that turned to printmaking. And so our house went from a house that looked like any other house in St. Louis, Missouri, to a place that was filled with art and vitality. And what she taught me was that you could respond to an image with your own feeling. You didn't have to be educated in how to respond to an image. Your own instincts could guide you about what an image said to you, which was an enormous gift because most people feel intimidated by art. And if they go to a museum, they sort of can't quite let themselves go because they don't know the art history or they don't know whatever, and so they don't feel qualified. So my mother gave me permission through her own journey to experience imagery in my own real way. And that became kind of a cornerstone of my love of symbolic imagery and my trust that my own instincts could guide me as to what meant something to me and what didn't.
That's a beautiful story.
So your mom created the first archetypal archive, and her spirit still inspires you in this wonderful mission.
Totally. Yeah. she gave me the confidence that I could trust my own instincts when it came to image, because she trusted hers. So our house was just, the house I grew up in was just filled with image from different, and art from different cultures, and it was all kind of alive.
What was your mom's first name, just to really honor her in this space?
Well, her name was Nancy.
Nancy
Singer. And
we will
she
tip
was
a
a
hat
real
to Nancy Singer.
Yeah, well, thank you. She was a real creative spirit. Sometimes she was a bit much for me, as mothers can be.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. It's so generous of you to be with us.
Yes, such a fun conversation. I love all the different places we went.
Yes,
it was great hearing more about ARAS.
And such an important conversation.
Thank you. It's a great joy for me to be able to talk to you. You're such good. You have such inquisitive minds, and your questions. I actually thought I didn't have to speak a lot of the time.
Well, we're going to put, of course, links to ARAS in the show notes, and we invite you to check it out. It is a wonderful resource that we've all tapped for years, and it's terrific to be able to tell you more about it and to have had this really important conversation about imagery.
Before we jump into our dream, and we're so happy that Tom's going to join us in circumambulating the images, I'd like to remind everybody that we have an online learning platform called Dream School, which has been very successful. We've had wonderful feedback from the students. It's a place where you can come, even if dream interpretation is new to you, and in 12 modules, learn how to understand, take apart a dream, translate it into meaningful metaphors, and unlock some of the messages that the dream maker is trying to send you. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about that, just go to our website, thisjungianlife.com, click on Dream School, and check out what we're doing there and see if it's a good fit for you.
So today's dream comes from a man who's 27 years old and is unemployed. And here's the dream. I was walking through a scenic nature trail and was amazed at the sight of ducklings and their mother. They were in a tree for some reason. After that, a great owl swooped down and snatched the ducklings from their mother, flew to a nearby tree, and started gorging them while the mother could only stare in horror. And the dreamer mentions that he was going through a depressive phase in his life, trying to find a meaningful direction. The main feelings in the dream were disgust, shock, and wonder. For associations, he just notes that he associates nature with peace and contentment. So I want to say that in some sense, this is a very appropriate dream for our subject today, because we have images, archetypal images, I would say, with very strong affect and not a lot in terms of personal association. So this is a good example of a dream that that might benefit from an archetypal treatment.
The two images that stand out to me, of course, are the image of the mother, and that includes Mother Nature, as well as the mother duck that is specifically imaged. And he says in his comments that he associates nature with peace and contentment. And the dream starts out, the psychic situation often is imaged by, where the dreamer, the dream ego is. He said, I was walking through a scenic nature trail and had this lovely feeling of seeing the mother and the ducklings. But nature has a beneficent aspect, just as our dreamer experiences and associates. But nature can also be the bringer of storms, tornadoes, floods, and destruction. So I'm just wondering about, how this dream brings the so-called negative, from the point of view of ego, negative image of the owl swooping down, and that horrifies our dream ego.
I'm in that same vein, Deb, around nature red in tooth and claw. That phrase that comes out of the Age of Enlightenment. And one fantasy that I'm having in the dream is that the mother and her children, the mother duck and the ducklings, are in the tree, which is unnatural for them to be in a tree. And so something in the psyche is out of sync in that moment. And a more primal, corrective process on a very instinctive and unemotional level gets activated. The owl comes in and starts feeding on the ducklings. So in one way, there is both an exercise of the reality principle, just the stark, unsentimental presence of nature, doing what nature does, and particularly interfering, or rather interrupting, what feels like a strange and slightly sentimental attitude, perhaps. So the dreamer says that they're in a depressive phase in their life and they haven't found a meaningful direction. Sometimes that's called an anaclitic depression, in as much as it's a regression back to the mother. So to have something come in and disturb the mother-duckling dynamic, to, in a sense, take the child portion out of the imagery and recycle it, so to speak. Because when an animal, when the owl is eating the ducklings, it's as if the ducklings are now transported into the owl. So you have an owl instead of a duckling. And you have something that's a predator, something of an alpha predator, much like a hawk. So I think there's several things I would say. Is there's an interruption in a sentimental indulgence, perhaps, in the baby-mother dynamic. There's a stark confrontation with reality that seems to be happening. And there's the introduction of a much more powerful image in the owl, which I think could be something of a guide, something of a psychopomp for the dreamer, that he may benefit from thinking of himself more like an owl than a duckling.
Do owls eat ducklings?
I think owls will eat anything they can get their hands on. I think they are predators. They generally hunt at night, so I don't know how much access they would generally have towards a baby bird. But I think if they could get their hands on them, I don't think they'd be inhibited about it. But it's a good question. I'm not a naturalist.
Just to that question of yours, Tom, there's this YouTube video that it's an amazing video. It clearly, there was like a nest cam on a nest of hawks, and you see these two juvenile hawks sitting there. It's at night, so it's got that kind of grainy black and white kind of look. And these two hawks are just sitting there, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, an owl swoops in and grabs one of the juvenile hawks and flies away. And the other juvenile hawk is just sort of sitting there. But it's so impressive because the owl is completely silent. You don't see it coming, and then it's just gone. They do really deal death from the sky, for sure. And they will eat other, juvenile birds. But would they eat a baby duck? I guess only if they, had access to it, like Joseph was saying.
They're also totally silent. If you've seen those YouTube videos as well, they'll do sound measurements, and like a normal bird will just sound like a bus clanging along the street, but then the owl moves across the soundstage, and it's absolutely no sound.
Yeah, it's something special about their feathers.
Yeah, they're extraordinary, adapted to hunting, and of course they're nocturnal. So this ability to see and hear and to know what is in the dark and to thrive in that environment, thrive in the unconscious is so interesting.
That's what I'm associating it with mostly, is that, nighttime is very much associated with the unconscious. And so here comes this creature of the night, the creature of the unconscious, to swoop down and eat the baby ducklings, which were, available in the dream, although out of place, as you said, Joseph, but, from a tree branch, which they could easily do, probably more easily than lifting them out of the water. So there's something about the power of the unconscious here to swoop down silently, swiftly, and rapaciously.
I mean, of course, the big thing that stands out in this dream is that the ducks are in a tree, which, it just doesn't happen. And Joseph, you brought up this issue about the kind of maybe an overly sentimental attitude. I'm wondering about mother energy, mother archetype, perhaps even the personal mother. I mean, ducks and ducklings, it's this kind of really sweet scene that you see in the spring with the ducklings, swimming right along behind the mother in a tight little row, or out, walking, and they all kind of follow her. And there is something really kind of maybe even sentimental about that picture. But this mother has somehow gotten her ducklings into a space where they don't belong. And by the way, it would be impossible because baby ducklings can't fly. So, I mean, ducks don't perch for sure, but unless these babies could climb the tree, there'd be no way for them to get up there. So there's something wrong or out of place, or, that perhaps exposes these ducklings to dangers that they wouldn't necessarily be facing if they stayed in their right place. Not that it's not dangerous being a baby duckling, because I'm sure it is.
I want to come to the defense of the young dreamer's ego. He's 27 years old, and he's in a depression. I'd like to know a lot more about the nature of the depression. What is it in his life that has gone wrong in some way and knocked him off track from his peaceful walk through life, or his pleasant walk through life? We can most 20-year-olds. I always say to anybody between 20 and 30, your only job is to survive until you're 30.
I love that.
Because it's really tough out there.
Of a 19 and 21-year-old.
It's really tough out there for 20-year-olds. Everything's been deferred. On the one hand, either they make $100 million by the time they're 30, or they're working at McDonald's. I mean, it's kind of a nightmare. And so it's very hard for 20-year-olds, I think. So even though the ducks are out of place, clearly something has happened to him that's thrown him off his path. And it is related to the mother, unquestionably, whether his mothering was so good that he wasn't prepared that he had such a good mother, if you will, or a good enough mother, that he wasn't prepared for the fact that Mother Nature can be very harsh and destructive. It does remind me of the ARAS lectures that I spoke of earlier, because one of them was about the Great Mother, from which Erich Neumann did his wonderful book on the Great Mother, part of which he classified as the terrible mother. Part of the Great Mother archetype is the terrible mother. And archetypally, we know of the terrible mother perhaps most pointedly in Kali, who is the Hindu goddess of death and destruction, and just loves blood and death. And this is a blood and death owl that swoops out of nowhere and destroys. And I think for young people, when death first comes on the scene, it's often so overwhelming they just have to deny it, and they want to live in a kind of notion of life being unending and there being no death. So this introduces the theme of death into this young man's psyche in a way and destruction that is really new. And I'd really like to know what happened in his personal life to introduce something so horrific for him. I remember the first time, just was recently recalling this, I was 12 years old, and my best friend, I got a phone call that his sister, who was riding a horse, rode into the sun, and she didn't see a guy wire from a telephone pole, and she broke her neck and she was dead. And I remember where I was sitting when I got that phone call. So there is something about how death and destruction enters a young person's life that is horrific. And that's what I'd want to know about this dreamer. What is it that's entered his life that is so horrific?
So there's a consideration here as for you of just this awful trauma that is too big to be assimilated by ego, and that there's a possibility that something traumatic has happened, and that these are the kinds of things that just puncture our worldview. An awful slashing at innocence. You know, your innocence as a child of this. These things aren't supposed to happen. This is not supposed to intrude on anybody's world.
Even if the ducks are sitting in the wrong place. Yeah.
Yes, even if the ducks are sitting in the wrong place. It's a horrible assault on innocence and an appropriate, optimistic kind of young person's innocence.
Culturally, 20 to 30 now is very different than 20 to 30 even when we were growing up, or 100 years ago. I think these kids often are just barely getting launched from the nest at 20 to 30, like a young ducklet.
Yes.
Well, the world is a fearsome, complicated, really enormous and confusing place. But I'd also like to speak up for the owl, as if I have taken on the role of the defender of owls. They're magnificent animals. A wingspan can be huge. We have seen them sometimes just as it's almost dark on the Cape, flying over the marsh and into the woods that are right by us. And they truly, he says in the dream that he was in awe at the sight of the ducklings. And one is in awe of seeing an owl in flight. And of course, you know, they were Athena's sort of totem animal. And Athena is the goddess of wisdom, and owls are associated with wisdom. So I think I'd like to say there's some real possibility here in what looks like such a negative portrayal of the rapacious owl, who also is powerful, can see, as owls are famous for, meaning consciousness and sight are associated. So there's a potential here moving forward for where is the owl spirit in our dreamer's psyche?
Well, and an owl is, in this dream, perhaps an image of kind of the dark side of the self. And that is shattering. It's, as Jung says, a defeat for the ego. And yet it can also be a confrontation with the transpersonal that forms us, shapes us, and moves us along toward wholeness.
Yeah, I think Joseph was also making that point about the owl in terms of a overly sentimental attitude towards nature and needing something of the wisdom of the owl, which does include the knowledge of life and death and destruction. It
is a moving dream, even though it's so simple. I think we all feel touched by the image.
So one of the things that I'm just noticing in the dream submission is that the fellow has included his email address and with ostensibly his name there. And it was an unusual name. I did a little bit of poking around, and it's a classic Finnish name. Now, this is not something that the dreamer has supplied, but it's fodder for our cultural imagination. So again, we don't know that this is applicable, but the duck, for instance, seems to play a substantial role in Finnish mythology. And its descent at the time of creation and laying 7 eggs, 6 of gold, 1 of iron, and participating in the creation of the world and brooding over them does have a much more substantive mythologic resonance than I would have guessed initially. So that does make it interesting that the duck has somehow been both disordered in as much as it's in a tree with its ducklings, but also interfered with by the owl. And in Finnish fairy tales, apparently, the owl is often associated with sorcery and dark magic. So glancing at that, it makes me just wonder perhaps there's another level to the dream.
Yeah, what strikes me, Joseph, of course, as Jungians who do a lot of dream interpretation, we always want to be careful to say these are our associations and we don't know enough about the dreamer. And of course, the dreamer's confidentiality and privacy is paramount to us. So we don't want to presume to know more than we do. On the other hand, in looking at a dream, one level we always want to focus on is not just the personal or the archetypal, but also the cultural level of the psyche. And in that regard, it occurred to me, and I don't know whether this has any relevance to the dreamer or situation, but I've been reading recently that Finland has joined NATO because they have some 800 miles of border with Russia, and that there's a real fear, I think, among Finnish people that the Russians might invade. And so at the cultural level, I'm wondering, has the dreamer picked up something in the Finnish, if he is Finnish, cultural psyche or unconscious or cultural unconscious of a deep fear of invasion and destruction coming from Mother Russia? That Mother Russia might be destructive towards the Finnish people at this particular moment in history. That's a wild gander.
Ooh.
We don't want to run afoul of any imagery.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.